My name is Dr. Roxanne Gonzalez, and I'm the Executive Dean here at Venango College. I've been here since July 1. I'm having a great time, and I'm looking forward to tonight's presentation. On behalf of the Barbara Morgan Harvey Center Advisory Committee, Clarion University, and our Venango campus, colleagues, and especially the Harvey family, I welcome you. John Harvey was one of the founders of the Venango campus 54 years ago and a champion of its growth and development for the remainder of his life. Joe and his children, Tom, Dave, Judy, and Joe Jr., established the center in memory of their wife and mother, Barbara Morgan Harvey. I think probably most of you know that that's housed over here in Sur Library. It's a very nice area. And my husband and I are new to the area, and I know he's already gone over a couple of times and had a look at the wonderful collection that's over there. The center recognizes Mrs. Harvey's lifelong passion for history and shares the abundant research and historical materials she collected over the years. The Harveys also created an endowment to bring their history to life through high-quality programming such as this evening's lecture. Generations of scholars will forever be grateful for their generosity, and we thank the Harvey family. Being new to the area, I have to just real quickly let you know that I had no clue about the history of this area. The only time I'd really been in Pennsylvania was to get stuck on I-80 for 5 hours. And that taught me a few things as well. But I have to say, one of the things that I've really enjoyed is getting to know the community, but the rich, rich history and the impact that it's had on a global and national scale. I had no clue until we moved here what the history is here. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's presentation. And with that, I'd like to introduce to you, and I know he's very, very welcome and knowledgeable for the community, Mr. Neil McElwee. Neil is the author of a number of early oil industry published historical works. He is regarded by his peers as an independent scholar in the field, often with a different point of view, which is always a good thing. He is a frequent speaker and lecturer on early oil industry subjects with an emphasis on pioneering personalities and organizations that established the American oil industry in the 19th century. Please join me in welcoming Neil. Neil, we're really looking forward to your presentation tonight, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Doctor. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's also a pleasure to speak to a group where I know half of you anyhow, so I don't have to feel like I'm going to be stoned at any time, at least not too soon in the presentation. It's good to see so many familiar faces. Dr. Gonzalez, you might be kind of interested to know that Lois and I have been here about 20 years now. We came up from Pittsburgh, and only in the last maybe 6 months or so we've been referred to people who've been, you're from Oil City. It used to be for the longest time, you're newcomers, you'll learn, you don't know anything yet, that kind of thing. So it takes time, and it did, but we have learned some things. I also want to real quickly make a reference to Joe Harvey. I actually had the pleasure of, somehow or other, we met Joe Harvey a number of times when we first came up here, and we met him Friday nights down there in the old Yesterday's restaurant where everybody would go in Oil City in those days and eat the fish dinners that they had. And he was always great. And I don't know why he bothered with saying hello to me, let alone spending a lot of time talking to me, but he did. So I did get to know him before he, of course, got older and kind of got out of circulation. It was a pleasure. Standard Oil. We know Standard Oil, most of us have some years under our belts, and we will remember some of these various trademarks and icons, advertising icons that Standard Oil of New Jersey used, starting back in the 40s and 50s. The Esso one is from the 40s and the 50s. I remember seeing that, my dad using Esso gasoline. Esso was synonymous with gasoline. It didn't mean anything beyond its gasoline. And you would see that tire as early as the early 50s, staring back at you from the billboards along the highways. He's a friendly-looking tire. A lot of people think that's Tony the Tiger and the sugar cereal thing, but he's not. That's the old Exxon Tiger. And he would always be saying, put a tiger in your tank, which means stop in the Esso station and buy some gasoline. So that's how most of us know Standard Oil. The people in New York and New England, they knew Standard Oil by the Mobil brand, Standard Oil of New York. The people in Ohio knew it as Sohio. We actually knew it as boron as well in western Pennsylvania. We knew former Standard Oil company, Atlantic Refinery. Atlantic, that actually was my dad's preferred gasoline. Maybe it's because we had so many Atlantic stations down there in the Mon Valley in the 40s and the 50s. I'm not sure. Then there was Standard of Indiana, which was American Oil. We had them around here for a while. Continental Oil, which became ConocoPhillips, that's out there in Oklahoma and the Rocky Mountain states. And then out in the West Coast, it's Chevron today, but it was Standard Oil of California and huge, another big company. Now, Esso and Standard of New Jersey, they changed that name to Exxon in 1972. They were kind of required to. There was some lawsuits going on about their use of the Esso phonetic spelling for the Standard Oil abbreviation, so they changed it to Exxon, and that became their corporate name eventually. We came to know them as Exxon, and then they merged with, what do you think, Standard Oil Company in New York's Mobil Oil, and it's now known as ExxonMobil, the largest oil company in the world after all of this time. And then out there on the West Coast, there's Chevron. That's the other largest oil company in the world, if there can be two such things. That's a long way from the days when Standard Oil of New Jersey is the holding company for all of the 32 other Standard Oil companies, was required by the Supreme Court to divest itself of all of those 32 other companies. And of course it did in 1911. That meant it got rid of all the refining companies, the Standard Oil Company, New York, obviously the Atlantic refining companies, Standard Oil of Ohio, Standard Oil of Indiana, Continental Oil, and the Standard Oil of California, just to name a few of the refining companies. It also was required to get rid of the pipeline companies, which affected this area directly. The National Transit Company had to be divested, and it was put on its own and became an independent activity from the Standard of New Jersey boardroom. Ohio Oil was required to separate itself from the big organization, and on the and the production companies, which we sometimes tend to forget. Standard Oil wasn't initially in production. It didn't get into production until the late 1880s, and its first production company was Ohio Oil up there around Lima, Ohio. Thanks, Pam. Pam schooled me on the correct pronunciation because I was calling it Lima when I first came up here, but it's Lima. The big Ohio field, which came after the Pennsylvania field, but Standard's first property was bought in the Ohio Lima field, and then they got involved here in the old Pennsylvania field and created the South Penn Oil Company, which many of you should recognize that name, and that production company stuck with them again until the divestiture was called for by the Supreme Court in 1911. Obviously, we know them. We know Standard Oil by the gasoline that they sold us. Now, back in the 19th century, it wasn't gasoline that you were buying from Standard Oil. It was illuminating oil. We came to call it in a general way kerosene. Kerosene was actually a trade name, but it stuck generally in the industry. And Standard's trade name for illuminating oil after some time became Rayo, the Rayo brand, and it really pushed the Rayo brand hard. That's a piece of display advertising that you see with a Rayo lamp on it. That's from the 1890s. And this is what Standard really was about in the latter couple decades of the 19th century, refining kerosene for these lamps being used all over the country and literally all over the world. We have a old Rayo lamp that was made for Standard Oil by Bradley and Hubbard, that famous lamp company in the late 19th century. They made over 1 million of these. These are nickel-plated brass. If you have one, don't take the nickel plate off, please, to make it look that nice brass color that you folks all seem to appreciate. I hate to see them when you go into these old shops and see a good old rail lamp reduced to just its base brass finish. When they were made with this nickel on them and real shiny. This is a beautifully designed lamp. Standard made it that way because they, of course, wanted their customers to have no trouble with the lamp whatsoever. It's very well ventilated. It burns very efficiently. It burns very long. And also it's very safe because that base is made in such a way, it's hard to tip it over. You didn't get kerosene in a gasoline station, obviously. You didn't get kerosene in a kerosene station in the 19th century. Where'd you get it? You got it at the drugstore. You got it at the hardware store. You got it at the grocery store. All those kinds of dealers sold kerosene out of the barrels. You took a jug like what we have shown you. This is actually ours. We're really proud of it, to tell you the truth. That glass kerosene container, you took it down, you walked down, or you took a buggy to one of these dealers, and you filled that up with kerosene, brought it back home, and you filled up your lamps. Standard Oil, the first Standard Oil company was Standard Oil of Ohio. Standard Oil of Ohio was founded by young men primarily. The two Rockefeller brothers, one was John, the other one William. William lived in New York City. That's where they wanted him to be because of the banking connections there and also because of the export business of New York Harbor. So he spent his time in New York, and John D. spent his time in Cleveland looking over the refinery operations which they were building up. Henry Flagler was a longtime business associate, young man, but a longtime business associate of John D. Rockefeller. He was another partner. Flagler's very wealthy relative by marriage, a man who was the uncle of his wife. From Belvedere, Ohio, a man by the name of Stephen Harkness was the silent partner in this early organization, put a lot of money into it. He's not remembered now in history all that well, but if you go to Bellevue, they're very proud of Stephen Harkness because they know he was one of the founding members and some of the big money behind the early Standard Oil of Ohio organization. And then a man by the name of Samuel Andrews, who actually ran the refinery, was another early member. So there weren't many of them, and they were essentially Cleveland or Ohio people. Samuel Andrews, brother William Andrews, was sent to Oil City, and in 1870 he opened up a buyer's office on Center Street, I should say, in Oil City at the railroad tracks. And you can see it. It was in the Mercantile Building. You see that interesting old historical photo that's to the left, that black and white, and that building, it looks something like a Gothic revival front. That was the Mercantile Building, and that's where Standard Oil had its offices, actually in the oil region, and they were buyers' offices primarily. The executives of Standard Oil, when they did come into the region, would stop in this spot in Oil City, and Oil City became the center of Standard Oil operations in the oil region. That has to be recognized. Across the street, by the way, I have the modern picture. I'm showing you that red brick building. That's Libby's. I don't know if she sold that building or not in recent years, but that was my friend Libby's building down there. That's the Wick building, among other things, but that building's on the footprint of the old Mercantile Building, which is where Standard Oil had its office in the oil region. Across the street from the Mercantile Building, across Center Street, right near the railroad tracks, was another very early buyer's office, and this was an office that was run by Charles Lockhart and William Frew. This is a great picture. I suspect most of you have seen this before. It's kind of a famous early picture of the Oil City downtown, or about 1870. Everybody was posing. Nobody was moving. And if they were, there would be a blur. So if you see any blurs there, the guy who wasn't doing what he was being told to do by the photographer, even the locomotive stopped and the engineer wanted to be in the picture and he wasn't moving. Everything was posed in this. And we're really glad they did it because historically, this was the early oil exchange on the streets of Oil City. They actually met when they had to get in out of the weather and out of the rain or whatever in the offices of Lockhart and Frew. which, by the way, was also a telegraph office, as both of those buildings were. There were two different competing telegraph companies at the time. And then a lot of really famous fellows in that group. I can't tell you what they are tonight, but it's a great picture. But at any rate, Lockhart and Frew had their buyer's office here. Now, Charles Lockhart, yeah, he's a Pittsburgh man, no question. Very early Standard Oil personality. He came to Oil City, the mouth of Oil Creek. Oil City wasn't here. He came here in September of 1859 because one of his business associates, if you will, William Phillips, was coming down back from Warren, bringing a keelboat back down the Allegheny River from Warren. He noticed an oil slick over there on the south side, just below the railroad tracks now, and at the same level where the Thorn parking lot is. He noticed an oil slick. He told Charles Lockhart and William Frew when he got down there to Pittsburgh, and he said, oh, there's a big oil slick up there right across from the mouth of Oil Creek, and these guys knew what it was. Lockhart already was buying crude oil from salt wells across from Tarentum on the Allegheny River, and he had a small side business, if you will. He actually worked for a wholesaler down there of dry goods and groceries and things of this nature. He didn't have his own business other than the side business of picking up oil from salt wells and trying to find buyers for it. And what he did very well because they were getting $60 a barrel for crude oil in the mid-1850s, so it was worth your while to pursue this. They all knew what this meant. There was a possibility of oil being below the water level, below the level of the mud, the bank. The Drake well had come in August. They all were aware of it. So they came up here in November and December with a keelboat. They pulled it by hand. This was a man-powered trip up from Pittsburgh with this rather heavy keelboat, and it had all the provisions that they would need to stay the winter. And they did stay the winter, and they drilled on that bank on the south side, and they brought a well in March of 1860 called the Albion. They brought another well in, Albion 2. Between the two wells, they were producing 20 to 40 barrels a day, which in the early days of the industry, that was a lot of oil, and it was still worth an awful lot of money. This wasn't at the point where oil was selling for 10 cents a barrel, which happened within a year after this. No, it was early. So they had oil. Now, William Phillips, who was part of this early excursion to come back up here, he's the guy who saw the oil slick. William Phillips formed a company. It was really Lockhart again and Frew, but it was called firm of Phillips and Frew. It was a drilling company from Pittsburgh. They leased the entire creek edge of the Tar Farm, 30 feet from the water line in, and they began to drill. When the third sand, famous Oil Creek third sand, was discovered in the summer of 1861. They pursued that. And what you did when you pursued the third sand is you simply went down to a deeper depth. They went down to 500 feet on the Tar Farm, and they had several Phillips wells. They were all called Phillips wells. They came in at big levels. They were flowing wells. The first one came in at 500 barrels a day. They weren't ready for it. It all went into the creek. They had no idea you could get that much oil out of the ground. Phillips number 2 came in October. It came in at over 4,000 barrels a day, and then tremendous amount of oil. And even though they had made preparations to try to capture this, they were overwhelmed. But they were digging these deep holes in the ground trying to store it. They did have some barrels around. And then they did capture some of that oil, and that was the oil that they used, this firm used, these guys used to provide the crude for the refineries that Charles Lockhart and his partners were building down there in Pittsburgh. The first one was named the Brilliant Refinery. You can see where it was today. All you have to do is go to the Pittsburgh Zoo. Right there at where the zoo overlooks the Allegheny River, where that run comes down, it's Washington Boulevard. Right in that section right there is where the Brilliant Refinery was built, and it was an excellent big refinery for its day. This was the first of a number of refineries that Lockhart and Frew would buy in Pittsburgh. There were a total of 7. Pittsburgh was the center of refining in the first decade of the industry in the 1860s, and these guys, Lockhart and Frew, were the biggest refiners down there. So there's that connection. They eventually merged with Standard Oil. It didn't take long after John D. Rockefeller's group asserted themselves as the leading refining center in Cleveland starting in 1870 and later. Now you'll notice there's a building kind of in the shadows. This one back here. Very important building, the Empire Line building. The Empire Line was the all the express freight service for the Pennsylvania Railroad in the region starting in 1865. And in the Empire Line, in the second floor, were the offices of Jacob Vandergriff and his partner at the time, George Foreman. Jacob Vandergriff came to by the way, in fairness to Lockhart and Frew, I should point out to you today, there is an historical marker telling you all of what I just said. We were very pleased that the PHMC would go along with putting this marker up. And if you can't remember what I said tonight, just go on down there in Center Street and stand beside Tomorrow's and look up there and say, oh, that's what Neil said. Oh, yeah, that agrees. It should agree with what we said because we had something to do with, I think, some of the writing of this. I have to check with Marilyn just who did that. Here's old Jacob Vandergriff. Now, Jacob Vandergriff came up to this area in late 1861. He was a riverboat captain. He was a famous riverboat captain on the Ohio River. Of course, nobody heard of him here. Why would nobody have heard of him here? I asked the kids this morning, why would anybody not have heard of him from up here? Because there wasn't anybody here to hear of him. People kind of forget that. It was all mud. There was nobody here. Yeah, there was a couple farmers, that's true. There was a little store, that's true, run by somebody from Pleasantville who happened to become a very well-known family. But no, nobody was here. So they never heard of Jacob Vandergriff. This guy shows up with a steamboat and 4 barges being pushed ahead of the steamboat. And he had to have a lot of skill to get up there. Even back in the 19th century, the Allegheny River was almost impossible to navigate a lot of the year. But having said that, he arrived with these 4 barges full of empty barrels, and it was consigned to the Maple Shade Oil Company on Blood Farm, which was at the time the Maple Shade, and those early flowing wells on Blood Farm were probably the biggest flowing wells. They competed with the Phillips. May have been even a little earlier. I don't really remember right now. But anyway, that's why he came up here, and he saw that there was so much crude, and you could buy it so cheaply if you could get up here, and you had a way of getting it back to Pittsburgh. And he realized there was a real big business opportunity here. You buy it cheap on the creek. You come up with bulk transportation. You use the bulk transportation to run it down the river at a very cheap price for transportation, and then there were refineries existing in Pittsburgh at the time. You sell it to those refineries in the season when they really need it, and they will pay you just about anything for it, no matter what you pay for it. On Oil Creek, he and his partner, a man by the name of Donnell, got into this business early, and they were very big. They were shippers. There were 20 shippers eventually along the banks of the northern bank of the river. In this case, it will be down to the right of the photo, the northern bank of the Allegheny River. Again, all mud. There were very crude timber warehouses built by shippers on the Allegheny River who were buying up on the creek the same way Vandergriff and his partner Donnell were, and they were buying cheap on the creek. They were able to buy because these men had money. They were able to buy when no one else was around here to buy it, but they had the cash. The producers would sell to them. These early guys, these shippers, were the early market for crude. They would sit on it until the market turned in their favor in Pittsburgh and in Philadelphia later on, and even up in Cleveland. And they would just wait, and then they would take it down and sell it. Vandergriff's particular shipping facility, if you will, was on what was called Chestnut Street at the time. I've said this to Oil City crowds in the past, and they say, oh, that can't be. Chestnut Street's over there on the north side. Chestnut Street's a couple places in Oil City, but at the time, there was a chestnut, a walnut, an oak, all down there along what we call Route 8 today, below where Cap Alloy is, down towards the eddy, the Moran eddy, and you can see that right across from the marina that we have here in Oil City. That's where these guys had located these early warehouses, crude warehouses, where they collected the oil coming down the creek, and then, like I say, they put it in bigger barge and took it down to Pittsburgh. Now, doing this year after year after year would create a lot of wealth. And Jacob Vandergriff became very wealthy. He was in a position to do just about anything he wanted to do up here. And thank goodness for us, he did an awful lot of good. He did get involved in production very early on. He was involved in that big Sherman well out there. Some of you guys in here probably know the story of the Sherman well, and you know that Sherman was destitute in the weeks or so before that well actually came in. He needed money, and nobody around here was willing to give him the money. Vandergriff put up the money to finish the well. Of course, Vandergriff took position in that well, and he did very well by that. There was a well right across from the Sherman on Oil Creek again called the Caldwell, and he did the same thing with those guys. So he got into production very early, and he liked it. He was successful in production from then on, and he became involved. His production companies, which became very big, and they were developed and managed here in Oil City, they then became involved with Standard Oil. The Standard Oil combination was put together, and they were the early production companies that Standard Oil turned to. Now, the other thing Vandergriff did, all related to Standard Oil eventually, was he developed some of the first gathering pipeline systems in the area. He had a pipeline going up to Fagundes, which is really Hickory Township. That's really West Hickory Township and the upper part of Forest County now on that side of the river. He had one going up to Shaw Farm just to the west of Siverly. That's important. Shaw Farm's up on the hill, and there's Siverly down there. He had another gathering pipeline system going up to the Bradensburg area. He actually it went to the Milton Farm, and that pipeline was called the Milton. And then he had another one that went down to East Sandy Creek, and he went up East Sandy Creek where that bike trail is now, and that got him into Clarion County very early. So that when those producing wells came in, Vandergriff was there with a pipeline. Now, who are those guys going to sell their crude oil to? Vandergriff. He could basically say, the value of your crude is this is what I will pay for it if you wanted to get out of the countryside. And they all went along with it. And so the gathering pipelines in the early days were the ones who actually set the price of crude, and Vandergriff had a lot to do with that, obviously. Now, all of that became part of a system called the United Pipelines of Vandergriff and Foreman. They expanded in Butler County, very big in Butler County. By 1873, the United Pipelines of Vandergriff and Foreman were known as the United Pipelines. Vandergriff opened the United Pipelines to new investing interests because he needed money. As wealthy as he was, it took a great deal of capital from combined sources to actually build these big pipeline systems and the big pump stations that went with it, and all those big iron storage tanks that were on the hillsides all around. It all took an immense amount of capital. It was an immense amount of risk. Vandergriff opened up the United Pipelines to investors, and who do you think got into it? Standard Oil of Ohio and John D. Rockefeller. Good for him. Now, the other thing that Vandergriff did early around here was build a refinery. It happened to be the biggest refinery in the oil region at the time. It was built up there in Siverly, down below the level of Shaw Farm. And the early pipelines that Vandergriff was putting together all were directed to Siverly and this Imperial Refinery that he established. These are some old historical photos, the black and whites of the Imperial Refinery in the 1870s. It was actually built in 1871, it burned down twice, so it was built 3 times, actually. Vandergriff remained the president of the Imperial Refinery until 1878. He sold it, though, earlier. He sold it to Standard Oil. He sold it in late 1873. At the same time, he sold some more of interest in the United Pipelines that he had. And in doing all this, he had an asset investment in the new Standard Oil combination that was so large, they made him a director of the Standard Oil Company. He was the only guy in the oil region who became a director of Standard Oil in those early days. We put up a another PHMC monument here. You know, I asked the kids this morning, and we had 100 kids here almost this morning. How many of you know where this is? Now, you know, kids don't answer. First, they don't answer even when they do know. So you have to understand that. We all are adults, we know that. But nonetheless, how many of you seen it? I could tell that there was nobody who was willing to put up their hand, and I don't think many of them, if any of them, had actually seen it, which really disappoints me. Then I said, well, do you guys get out? No answer. You have to get out to see this stuff. You can't just drive. Well, in this case, you can drive up to it. All you have to do is go into the Justice Park parking lot, and pull up to the curb, and you get to see this sign, the Jacob Vandergriff sign, which is right there in Oil Creek. And when we put this up years ago, and it really was years ago, PHMC in the Oil Heritage region, Maryland, who was sitting there with Lois, they were culprits in this. When we put this up, we were pretty proud of it, because this was considered quite an honor by Pennsylvania History and Museum Commission, and they hadn't put up too many of these kind of historical markers. And this one's the big marker. This is the big baby, and they pay for, what is it, Meryl? At least half of this? I forget. But it's an expensive marker, and they were willing to put up the money, and we have it there. And we like it because it's on the creek and at the mouth of Oil Creek, because that's what Vandergriff originally was. He was a boatman who brought his steamboat up to the mouth of Oil Creek, and it took off from there. The Imperial Refinery site, this is a modern picture. Now you have to be able to, you see the big curve in the railroad right away in this historic photo. Well, you catch that same curve in the today, modern era, current roadway. When you go up there into the industrial park, and in a way, that's probably the most identifiable feature of the industrial park now, that you can actually relate to the old original Imperial Refinery. There's some stone blocks right along here. If you get back there, and I'm not going to encourage you to go back there because it is private property, but it's also city property, so you go, just behave yourself. Those stone blocks are likely from the early Imperial Refinery time. They're what they call ashlar rough-cut stone. I don't think Oil Well Supply was using that kind of stone when they eventually acquired this property. They acquired it, and after the Imperial Refinery shut down in 1896, it was dormant. The property was dormant. The refinery was being dismantled, and then Oil Well Supply bought this property in 1901. And from 1901, 1903, they built their new industrial facility. They were located downtown before they went out to Siverly. They were actually in Betsy's Place. Of course, the post office wasn't there. There was the former Ennis Manufacturing Company. That was an Oil Well Supply facility. They were right there where the Salvation Army is today. That was their principal manufacturing facility. All of that was consolidated, and they went out to Siverly in 1903 when the new plant was open to Oil Well Supply activity. And what did Oil Well Supply call it? They called it the Imperial Works. And that is famous. The Imperial Works of Oil Well Supply, we get around because of our interests around the country. We run into people, and they bring that up. The Imperial Works. Wow, have you actually seen the Imperial Works of Oil Well Supply, which was closed in 1982. But it is a pleasure to run into people who think of us and talk about us as like this is a very special place. These people were from Oklahoma. Marilyn and Lois both remember them. In fact, they visited here. They were really great people. But boy, you know the Imperial Works? That's really how they kind of introduced themselves. Yes, we do. We know the Imperial Works. The name is associated with Vandergriff's enterprise, and you can see it prominently over on the south side of Oil City on the east end by the church. This is, see, Imperial Avenue is crossing 3rd in this particular photo. You can see we did capture the street sign in that little inset there, that photo. Why in the world were they calling this Imperial Avenue? Because when Vandergriff bought this property in 1866, he bought it as a real estate venture to build homes for the boatmen who were still on the river and other workers who were part of his enterprises. They bought the lots from him, built their houses here, and lived here. The riverboat pilots lived here. This was called Imperial. Everything east of Wilson Avenue now. That was where that property started, and it went off down towards what I call Sam's, the villa now. And Vandergriff and actually George Foreman, they owned this, and Imperial. And they liked the name Imperial. They used the principal avenue, if you will, was Imperial Street in the Imperial community, and it stuck. It's still in the legacy of Standard Oil. You see the Imperial name being used here or there. Atlantic used it as one of their premium gasoline brands. It all comes from right here on the south side of Oil City. Now, I know some of you think I'm making that up. I can see you, Lois. The other Lois. I can see you. But no, that's the way it was. Now, if you remember, Vandergriff and Foreman had their offices in the railroad buildings beside the railroad track. They moved in 1873 to this corner of Seneca and Sycamore Street, where this new Collins house, Collins block was built. And the corner of the Collins block was right flush to Sycamore Street and Seneca. That part of the Collins block was the Oil City Trust Company. The other part of it was the Collins House, which became known as the Arlington Hotel, which unfortunately is no longer with us. It was taken down in the 1966 redevelopment of Oil City. I guess that was an improvement, but it was an historical loss nonetheless. And the Oil City Trust Company was the center of Vandergriff and his partnerships, the center of their activity, and also the center of the United Pipeline activity in the early days, before the time of the National Transit Company, before the time of the National Transit Building. All of that pipeline activity was located on the second, third, fourth floor of the Oil City Trust Company, and all those pipelines and all those pump stations were controlled on those floors. Jacob Vandergriff, young brother-in-law, William J. Young, was also in this building, as well as John R. Campbell. These three names, more than any others, are the names you associate with Standard Oil Ventures, and Joseph Seep, I beg your pardon, and Joseph Seep. Those four names, the names you, for the most part, associate with early Standard Oil activities in Oil City, because they all worked in Oil City, no matter where they lived. William J. Young was the first cashier of the Oil City Trust Company. It was a bank, yes, but it was an investment bank. It wasn't a retail bank. It wasn't a savings bank. It was an investment bank. You didn't go in there unless you had business in the oil industry and you were looking for a lot of money, but you yourself were worth a lot of money. William J. Young was the cashier. By the cashier, that's a 19th century term. That means that's the manager of the bank enterprise. He was named the manager by Vandergriff. Vandergriff started, he wasn't the first president, George Foreman was, but George Foreman left Oil City very early in 1875, so Vandergriff assumed the role of president of that. He was president of the United Pipelines, he was president of the Oil City Trust Company, he was president of a variety of production companies that he was into at the time. He was president of everything. And it was his money that was financing so much of this early activity. John R. Campbell was the longtime treasurer of a number of Vandergriff partnerships that started back in the 1860s and just carried forward till John R. Campbell retired from the Standard Oil Group. Now, this is Sycamore Street. Building was put up in 1873. The Oil City Oil Exchange, I'll catch this for the TV guys. The Oil City Oil Exchange was first established in some rooms in the old Collins Hotel, or what we called later on the Arlington Hotel. That's where they met. And they met there from 1873, 74 till 1878. While there, so much trading in oil occurred that the New York papers recognized Oil City to be the third largest trading center in the country of any any sort of any commodity, stocks, whatever, in terms of value. It was the third largest. The only two centers of trade that were larger was New York City itself and San Francisco. This was a very critically important financial center in the late 19th century, and certainly to the oil industry. It was the center of oil activity. You know how we like to refer to Oil City as the hub of the industry, which was a name given to it by writers in the 19th century, and that's an appropriate way of referring to Oil City at the time. It was the center of all of that activity, particularly financial, in the industry. Now, they were very successful, the exchange, in the rooms that they had in the Arlington Hotel. Through 1877, they were so successful that with their surpluses, the Oil City Oil Exchange built a new building right across, Sycamore Street. This is the new Oil City Oil Exchange, and it became the center of that trading activity afterwards. What did they actually trade? Yes, they were trading crude oil. But what? They didn't bring the crude oil in barrels to the floor of the oil exchange. No, they brought the paper that represent ownership of the crude oil that they had in storage in the pipelines and in the big iron storage tanks that were all over these railroad center areas where the gathering pipelines would bring the crude to. These oil certificates were denominated in 1,000 barrels, and they were kept in the offices of the Oil City Trust Company for safekeeping for the owners of the crude that had it. And then when the owner of the crude wanted to sell some of his oil, he'd come to the Oil City Trust Company, pick up the certificates they had in safekeeping for him there, and then he'd walk across Sycamore Street, and he'd walk on the trading floor of the new oil exchange, and he would say, "We have a hum." If you're wondering what I'm doing here. But he would say, "I have 10,000 barrels of crude. I want such and such for it," and see if anybody would respond. It was sold vocally. There was no cabal to it. There was no special collusion to it. It was very open. If you owned oil and you had the oil certificates to prove that you did, you could take it to the Oil City Exchange. If you were a member, you could actually offer it for sale or bid for it for sale on that bull ring they had, and if you did, you went through a broker. That's how it was done. There were 300 members on this oil exchange. That meant 300 people could actually participate in the trading on the floor, and then again, if you weren't a member, you went through one of the brokers. At the end of the day, the paper would be exchanged for money, and the whole account would be cleared. There were 30 brokers as members of the Oil City Oil Exchange, so 30 brokers and 270 individual members. It was expensive to belong to the exchange. They did it not to be exclusionary in the sense that they were, they just didn't want common people in there, but they wanted to make sure you had the money to honor your commitments when you made your trades on the floor. And that's the reason for the expensive memberships. The biggest brokers on the exchange were brokers associated with Standard Oil. One was the H.L. Lewis Acceptance Company, or Henry Lewis Acceptance Company. Henry Lewis was the broker for Standard Oil's buys or purchases for all the refinery property they had up in Cleveland, the refinery property they had down there in Pittsburgh, and essentially in the western part of Standard Oil's activities. The Jabez Boswick Company was the other big broker buying on the floor of the Oil City Exchange, and they bought all Standard Oil's needs for the refineries they had in New York Harbor, New Jersey, and New York. If you didn't have enough crude to warrant a certificate, that is, if you were a small producer and you only had, let's say, 700 or 800 barrels of crude for sale, what you would do is you would get that listed as a credit on the books of the United Pipelines, and the United Pipelines would hold it there for you. United Pipelines is always charging storage charges. You have to understand that this didn't happen for free. You had to pay those storage charges while you kept your crude in the pipelines or in the big iron storage tanks that the United Pipelines built and owned. But you could sell your crude through an agency, and that agency became the famous Joseph Seep Purchasing Agency, and Joseph Seep would buy all of those batches of crude that were less than 1,000 barrels. He wouldn't buy certificate oil. Certificate oil could only be bought on the floor of the exchange, the Oil City Exchange, and the other exchanges in the oil region, I might add. But Seep, with his offices here in Oil City and his office up there in Titusville and the offices later on in Bradford, et cetera, he would buy this lesser amount of crude that all these small producers, but there were so many of them, wanted to sell, and that was called the credit oil, and he bought it. Now, he stated the price for it, but it wasn't by dictate. It wasn't, I think I'm going to just offer you guys $10 a barrel for your crude today. No, he would pay attention to the trading activity on the floor of the Oil City Oil Exchange. He would take the average of the opening trades and the closing trades, the highs and the lows, and they'd come up with a price set on a predetermined way of doing it. Everybody was aware of it, and that's what the Seep agency would pay for barrel credit oil, that is denominations of less than 1,000 barrels. He did this for quite some time. The Seep agency actually remained with South Penn Oil into the 1950s. It lasted quite a long time. Seep later on would actually set the price of crude for credit oil, again, not the big batches, but the small batches, and he would do it based on what the markets of the world demand. And people have criticized that practice, the Standard Oil practice of just standing up there and saying, this is what we'll pay for crude. This was based on what the markets of the world were paying. This was occurring when Seep was doing this, and it was in the 1890s, and he was looking at Antwerp. He wasn't looking at what was happening on Oil Creek. He was looking at the markets in Antwerp and the price of kerosene and all. It was a very complicated way of coming up with what a fair price for crude would be, and Seep would state, this is what I'll pay. Ergon does the same thing, the exact same thing today. American Refining up there in Bradford does the exact same thing today, and you can read their statements of what they are willing to pay for crude on a given day by just opening the derrick and looking in there, and that information is in the financial page. Seep became very prominent in the area. Many of these Standard Oil men left for Pittsburgh, or left for Cleveland, or left for New York City. And Seep, who lived in Titusville, but he worked in Titusville and primarily in this City Oil Exchange originally in Oil City, he became very prominent. When Vandergriff left Oil City, Vandergriff was the president of the Oil City Trust. Seep became president of the Oil City Trust, for example. This shows you how much trust Vandergriff had in Joseph Seep. The boiler works and the tube works that were built after the boiler works were put up in Oil City. Seep was the president of that. Seep became, when there was that divestiture of South Penn Oil, who do you think was the president of South Penn Oil? Who was made the president? Again, Joseph Seep. He played a major role in all these activities in Standard Oil, and he's just quite a guy. And by the way, now Marilyn and I and Lois and I know that this is needed, but for some reason, because Joseph Seep's from Titusville, and we know where he lived, it's an appropriate thing to do to put up a marker for him. But for some reason or other, the Historical Society up there, people up there, and some of you heritage guys know these folks. I don't know why they haven't put up a marker for Joseph Seep. We'd be glad to help them do the research. We shouldn't really have to because they know so much about it in the first place, but he's deserving, another individual of the industry is deserving a marker, and it should happen. It just should happen. Joseph Seep's grandson was Joseph Harvey, the man I told you that we used to run into down there in yesterdays on Friday nights when we were all eating fish when Lois and I first came up here, great guy. He was Joseph Seep's grandson. And the Harvey family is the reason why we're having this get-together tonight. They sponsored these lectures. They've sponsored the Barbara Morgan Harvey Center for the Study of Oil History. It's a very nice section of the library and the SOAR library. They've done so much, and we're certainly grateful to them for it. The Oil City Boiler Works was never owned directly by Standard Oil, but it was built and owned by Standard Oil men. It was built by a partnership of Benjamin Vandergriff, Jacob Vandergriff's eldest son, Michael Geary, who was a boiler maker from Buffalo and then Titusville, and then he came down. He was an Irishman. And he became associated with these guys, and as an Irishman, he became associated with Daniel Day. So Daniel Day, Michael Geary, Benjamin Vandergriff were the original partners of the Oil City Boiler Works. It was put up in 1876. That building is still with us today. It's now Webco. I like the various shots of this. The one on the upper left-hand corner is the one you think of normally about the restaurant. Italian restaurant that's right there at the corner at the alley is a marking point that I tell people. You can find the old Oil City Boiler Works building above it in the facade. That's in the lower left-hand corner. In the modern picture, there was for the longest time two pieces of stone, and in relief, one said Geary and the other one said O'Day. Now those stones have been removed. If you stand on the newly paved PennDOT a parking lot on Elm Street and look across Duncan Street at another of the Oil City Boiler Works buildings, and look up, and in faded white paint in big letters you can see the words Oil City Boiler Works, and then below that Geary water tube boilers, all an indication of what occurred here in the past. This was a big plant. You can see a historical photo of it and down there in the right-hand corner. One of the important things about what they made the iron tanks that were being used to store crude oil. They made the boilers that were being used to provide the steam power out there in the field for the engines they made to do the work, of the pumping work and what have you around the wells. So it was the power source. In its heyday, they did, according to various sources, they hired 600 men in the Oil City Boiler Works. This would have been in the 1880s, late 1880s, 1890s. And one of Oil City's biggest employers. It's also one of the reasons why the neighborhoods up off of Plummer were built, because these guys made good money, the Boiler Works, and then they were able to build those homes up there and off of Plummer. The other big industrial employer for men working in the metals industry was the National Transit Shops. Now, the National Transit Shops started out as the United Pipeline Shops, actually in Petrolia, and then United Pipelines moved those Petrolia shops up here to Oil City, and they set them up at the downriver side of Petroleum Street, just past the bridge. And that was the location these shops are still found today. The name United Pipeline Shops changed to the National Transit Shops when the National Transit was incorporated in 1881 and absorbed all of the assets of the United Pipelines in the ensuing year or two. Those shops eventually were known as the National Transit Shops, like I say. And with the divestiture in 1911, and this whole activity became independent, they had to go their merry way, no longer connected to Standard Oil New Jersey. They referred to it as National Transit Pump and Machine. Now, some of those buildings, a good many of those buildings are gone, but these buildings along here, it's Electrolyte today, so it isn't all gone. Not at all. And they employed, I believe their peak employment was close to 1,000. Okay. If there's any building in the oil region you associate with Standard Oil, just one, it would be this one, the National Transit Building. National Transit Building was built in 1890, however. It was started in 1888, built in 1890. So a lot of that early activity associated with Standard Oil companies occurred before the National Transit Company went up. But when it was finished in 1890, all that activity, it was in the Oil City Trust Company. It just moved up the street a block, and they moved in here. These photos, images, are from an 1896 souvenir publication from the Derrick, and they show who the management team was, the executives that had their offices in the National Transit Company. But at that year, 1896, Calvin Payne, who lived in Titusville but worked on here in Oil City, Calvin Payne was the manager of the National Transit Company. By then, Daniel Day was the vice president. His office, though, was in New York City. The operations of the National Transit were all that, the management of that operational activity in the field was all controlled here in Oil City. Some of that executive activity occurred on Broadway in New York City. Some of the men in these pictures, a lot of you guys knew these fellows. Well, maybe you didn't know them, but you certainly knew the names. Up there in the left-hand corner, Eleazar Strong. Eleazar Strong was associated with the gas activity of National Transit Company. He had, you know where Chuck Stubler's house is, what I call Chuck Stubler's house. That's where Eleazar Strong lived. And right there to the right of him is Captain John Tonkin. Captain Tonkin was also associated with the gas interests of the National Transit Company. And his house, again, was on West 3rd. You guys, in more modern years, noticed the old Dr. DeShong's office. I think he sold that house. But that was Tonkin's house in the late 1880s, 1890s. To the right of that is John Klein. John Klein was the superintendent of the National Transit shops. John Klein, when you go to these places where they have these big parks that are full of machinery, and you have all these guys who've invested in these old machines found in the oil field. When I say old, I'm talking machines that are as big as this room, just one of them. And they bring them in flatbeds. They're all wealthy men, and this is their hobby. A lot of them are doctors. There's one out there in that place down there towards Punxsutawney. Cool Springs, yeah. When you go out there, they think John Klein, they talk about John Klein like he was a saint. They talk about him with reverence. He designed so many big pumping engines for initially the Standard Oil uses, but he designed so many of them, and all the ways you handled all that big, heavy equipment, and to move not only crude oil, but also to move natural gas. So you get down there, and when you mention you're from Oil City, those guys will say, did you know about John Klein? Well, I happened to know about him because I went down there to give a talk, and it was about John Klein, so that helped. But they were just full of enthusiasm. They couldn't hear enough from me, and truthfully, I didn't know all that much, I'll admit it, but they couldn't hear enough from me, and they added to the knowledge I had of Klein. He was just a huge name back in the 19th and early 20th century, and of course Standard Oil. Then on the second row there's J.B. Crawford. Crawford was from Emlenton Associated. He was a treasurer of natural gas interests at the time. Calvin Payne himself, to the right of him, is J.B. Maitland. J.B. Maitland was the man who lived here in Oil City, worked in the National Transit Building, and all those iron storage tanks. He was responsible for all of those iron storage tanks that were put up by Standard Oil. When they put up these iron storage tanks, you have to realize they had to go out and buy the land, they had to grade the land, clear it, they had to grade it, they had to make sure that the graded land could hold the weight of a tank, and then they had to order the iron from the boiler shops, those who could supply them to build the tanks. Then they had to erect the tanks, which means they had to find the men who knew how to do it. And that was a real challenge. A lot of times there was a need for more tankage. They couldn't find the erection people to do it. They had to go to Wales to actually find guys who could actually work with iron. The English, no, they were way ahead of us for quite some time. And in some respects still are in that kind of work. He did all of that, and Maitland was responsible for all the iron tankage that was built by United Pipelines, a division of the National Transit Company. They say, there's a reference in one of my histories, that in 1884, there were 1,450 some iron tanks of 1,000 barrels of capacity or larger. 1,000 of those tanks were built and owned by Standard Oil. Think of the immense capital cost that was. That represented, in those days, over $10 million in capital investments, which was a huge amount of money. And that's what Standard Oil was doing with all these storage charges that they were charging producers while they were holding it in their tanks and in their pipelines. They're building tanks. It cost a lot of money, and it took a lot of money. That wasn't going to be done by Joe Blow hanging out in the corner here in Oil City. No way. It just took a great deal of money, and it took a very big organization to do it. On the third row, there's R.W. Porterfield. Porterfield, I think, was gas industry. Again, he was from Emlenton. That's a big name down there in Emlenton. John R. Campbell, the treasurer, United Pipelines. And then McSweeney and Elliott, both of them. There's always attorneys in these management groups. And Henry McSweeney and M.F. Elliott were the attorneys. McSweeney himself was the solicitor of the United Pipelines. And he's also the guy whose house, when he left for New York City to work in Standard Oil of New York, when he left there, that house, he contributed, he donated to the Bell's Letter Club. All right. Now, we know the National Transit Company, the beautiful National Transit. We all recognize it's a wonderful piece of architecture. We could talk forever about the architecture of the building. That's at one end of Seneca. North of that, at the other end of downtown Seneca Street, is another a Standard Oil building, the United Natural Gas Company building. This is a gem of architecture when you're into that, and I think many of you know I am. It's elegant. It's a wonderful small office building that just reeks good breeding, good taste, and truthfully money, because those bricks aren't ordinary common facade bricks. They are special bricks. The pediment and the styling of the thing is a styling that you would expect an educated group of people to put up. And the really interesting thing, there's a lot of corbelling up here in the cornices, blah, blah. I can go on and on and on about it because we don't have enough time to do that. But look at these two wonderful old gas lamps, which I bet most people don't even bother to look at anymore. They were on either end of the United Natural Gas Company building. This building was put up in 1912, actually 1 year after the divestiture of Standard Oil New Jersey's Standard Oil companies, but it was put up by United Natural Gas. It had to be very nice in its heyday. Those gas lights, they had them down there in Pittsburgh when I was young, and I remember walking around downtown Pittsburgh with these gaslit streets, and it's wonderful. It's just, there's nothing like it. If you haven't experienced natural gas lighting on a city street from big gas lamps like this, you've missed something in life. I really mean it. It's just wonderful. And fortunately, the lamps are still there. Of course, nobody has the money to operate them anymore. This was donated to the V&A. And look at the name on that, next to the last line, to the right there, the name R. Montgomery. H.G. Montgomery, I hope I have that. It's either J.G. or H.G. Montgomery. Can you help me out on that, Pam? Do you remember his initials of his first name? I forget. I'm sorry, Mr. Montgomery. But Mr. Montgomery was the guy who organized the group and I think it was E.P. Boyle from the Derrick. In 1950, they organized a group of businessmen who raised the money to buy the land we're sitting on tonight. They did it in 1950, 1951. Montgomery at the time was president of the United Natural Gas Company, and in memory of him and to commemorate that role he played, they actually named Montgomery Hall, which is at the western end of this campus. So that's where those names come from. You see it shows up again on this brass plaque. The Montgomerys have done a lot for this area. Right across the street from the United Natural Gas Company office. And by the way, Standard Oil owned a number of natural gas companies in the 1880s, 1890s. It was inevitable. They had to do something with the gas that was coming out of the ground while they were drilling for oil in the Pennsylvania oil field. They owned a number of companies. Calvin Payne, who you saw in that array of men who were the managers and executives in the National Transit. Calvin Payne was the vice president of virtually all of those gas companies, and he was responsible for that development. As well as other things. He was responsible for the development of the gathering pipeline system and storage in the big McDonald field in 1892. He did an awful lot. But those gas companies were all organized into what was called the Natural Gas Trust, and then the Natural Gas Trust. This is all, again, the 1880s and 1890s. That Natural Gas Trust, which was a combination, a basket full of all Standard Oil's natural gas companies, was shifted to Standard Oil of New Jersey, and then Standard Oil of New Jersey was advised by S.C.T. Dodd that they divest themselves of all of their natural gas holdings, and then they were sold off to National Fuel. And that's how National Fuel came to own these. Now, National Fuel is not a Standard Oil company. I point this out. It legally was not. It wasn't. It wasn't. But it's amazing how many Standard Oil executives, including Henry Rogers, were on the National Fuel board. Henry Rogers was actually the first president of National Fuel. So it's a Standard Oil culture. And a lot of this is, yes, legally it's no longer part of Standard Oil, but the culture is still there. The historical background is still there. You don't get away from your roots. And the roots for these companies is all Standard Oil. Across the street from that building we now have, that beautiful building at the other end of Seneca Street, the United Natural Gas building with all those great gas lamps. Across the street is this building, the commercial building that you see on the left there, the Drake building, now called Drake Commons. Now, again, Standard Oil did not build this building. This was a commercial venture. But a Standard Oil company occupied this building. Now, what isn't understood too well anymore is South Penn Oil, which is one of Standard's, like I say, production company in the Pennsylvania oil field. South Penn Oil bought the controlling interest of Pennzoil in 1925. They owned the majority of the company. And then in the ensuing decades, they just kept acquiring more and more. So by 1955, they owned all of Pennzoil. So South Penn Oil and Pennzoil at that point in time, same interest, same financial interest completely. When this building, the Drake building, was completed in the 1920s, Pennzoil moved into Lewiston. I think he said the top 2 floors. Is that correct, Lou? Well, that's what he said. And where's Lou? Is Lou awake? Anyway, Pennzoil moved into it. So this became known as the Pennzoil office building, Drake building. And then South Penn Oil itself, which had become a vagabond. South Penn Oil left Oil City and went to Pittsburgh. Actually, when Vandergriff and W.J. Young went to Pittsburgh, Young went down to Pittsburgh in 1889, and he moved all his affairs into the Vandergriff building on 4th Street, which was the financial street in Pittsburgh. He was vice president of South Penn Oil. He took the offices of South Penn Oil to Pittsburgh. And then it didn't get out of Pittsburgh for a couple decades. It ended up in the Chamber of Commerce building down there. And then, and by the way, that's where the Joseph Seep Agency then went. And then it went to Bradford. It was in Bradford, the office, there's a South Penn Oil building up there in Bradford, brick building. And those people in Bradford, by the way, do not even mention its existence when they give you a tour of the local downtown, which I really find very interesting. I don't have the nerve to ask them why. But nonetheless, they don't mention it as standing. It's the best looking building there. And the Joseph Seep Agency went up there to Bradford. And then when the gentleman up in Bradford, who was the president at the time of South Penn Oil, retired, the sewers had something to do with this, but they moved South Penn Oil back to Oil City, and they moved in with Pennzoil itself in the Drake building. And this was the last headquarters of South Penn Oil, Pennzoil, until they were acquired by those new interests, those Texas interests, which took it all to Houston. Now, on Elm Street, you see the buildings that's now the ORA office building It's hard to imagine because it's such a good-looking building architecturally, but this actually was a service station owned by Pennzoil. It was a showboat station. This was the one where the business was saying, we're Pennzoil, we're proud of it, and we have the best-looking gas station, service station in Oil City. Now, I'm sure Quaker State would argue that point with them, but nonetheless, that was the thinking behind here. It was eventually sold as commercial property and rental, and eventually Oil Regional Alliance bought it. It still exists. It's a beautiful building. I like this image down here at the bottom right-hand corner, this old black and white, because it shows both the South Penn Oil name and the Pennzoil name on the service station property, which you don't normally see. And for people who are doubters about, because Penn couldn't have owned Pennzoil, that couldn't be. That's. How about the proofs in the photo? The Eclipse, the great Eclipse Refinery, located along Route 8 in Sugar Creek Township, mile long. You see where that stack is. That stack is, I think, where the Shaw property is today, very close to the Eaton Park. But that stack essentially divided the property to the upstream side, the upriver side, on going up to Oil City. Contained a lot of those storage tanks you associate with the refinery and the refineries and the industrial buildings with the Eclipse down to the left. Eclipse Lubricating Oil Company was a Standard Oil company. They bought it from some Franklin investors in 1876, a long time ago. It was a small company not doing well. Henry Flagler actually bought it. Henry Flagler then bought 1,200 acres in Sugar Creek Township up along Route 8. They didn't call it Route 8 then. It was called the Franklin to Oil City Road. And it was on that property that the much larger Eclipse Refinery was built. It was called the Eclipse Lubricating Oil Company until 1892, when there was a reorganization of interest. The Standard Oil Industry was really trying to simplify the corporate organization, and they assigned the Eclipse Lubricating Oil Company to the Atlantic Refining Company, which had its principal offices in Philadelphia. This is the one that Charles Lockhart founded. This was the second largest refinery in Pennsylvania, period. The only larger one was the Atlantic Refinery in Philadelphia. The next biggest refinery was the Atlantic Refinery in Pittsburgh. They had a huge presence in Pennsylvania, and the one here in Venango County was very big in itself. And well, I pointed this out to the kids again from Rocky Grove. They didn't have a clue. They just looked, glassy-eyed. I would say, maybe your grandfather or great-grandfather worked here. They didn't care. I hate to say it, but yeah, sure. But those people who worked here up until into the 1930s, they sure did, because this was a great employer. They employed something like 700 people at its peak, and then in the 1930s, they made the decision to shut this refinery down, and it was taken down by 1935, I believe. That's an approximate year's date, so it's gone. Now, obviously, those of us who live around here know, it's not really gone. I'm sure we all remember the trucks with the soap suds along Route 8 on the other side of Route 8 for years and years. You're pumping soap suds into all this property, trying to remediate it for new uses. It was fun to watch. It was fun to watch all this stuff come out of the ground. It went in clean and came out yucky, and you wondered where they took it. But they finally remediated all this property, and who do you think paid for it? Standard Oil. They had to pay for it. It was required. The successor to the Atlantic Refining Company, and I don't know which one of the surviving Standard Oil companies actually picked up that responsibility. Now it'd be, I guess, ultimately it'd be Shell. But having said that, there is a building down there. The smokestack came down. All this came down. You do see some foundations, huge foundation, concrete work. You do see that here and there, if you know what you're looking for. But the building that still stands, that's easy to spot, is the office building for the Penn West Office Center. That's the office building. It's painted gray now. When you come out of the parking lot for Giant Eagle down there and Kmart down there, and you're going up Route 8 or going down Route 8 and look right across Route 8, you see Penn West Office Center, and that really was that was the principal office for the Atlantic Eclipse Refinery Works. Now, There's another survival of the Imperial, the Atlantic time, and that is this beautiful little building that's right across the railroad tracks of McDonald's in downtown Oil City. That was an Atlantic refining station. It was moved by Ron Gustafson, I don't know how long ago, maybe 15, 20 years ago, from its original site to save it. This is an architectural gem. They didn't make many gas stations like this. It was designed, people are doing some historical work on it. I'll just say it was designed by an architect, and that pagoda look is deliberate, and it's just a fine, fine piece of gasoline station architecture, and it represents the Atlantic refinery. It's a survival from that period, and we're really lucky to have it in Oil City. It's Standard Oil. Obviously, these Standard Oil men lived somewhere. They lived primarily in Oil City. Some lived in Franklin, and some lived up there in Titusville. We don't have the Jacob Vandergriff house, and it was passed on to W.J. Young, his brother-in-law. That house, which was up on Colbert, between Graff and Colbert, right there as it comes down to that triangle where the Youth Alternatives building is now, that would be down here. It's very hard for me to see it so close. The Youth Alternatives building is somewhere down here at the bottom of Graff. That wasn't built up that way in 1871 when Vandergriff built this house. You'll note that there's a gable that faces the Allegheny River and Colbert, and to the right of that gable in the main house is a tower. Let's see if I can pick it up here. Can you see the tower? In amongst the trees. It was impossible to get a good picture of this because it was right on the river. You had to be removed. You had to be across the river or on the river to try to get a photograph of it. But that's where Vandergriff would spend his time up here, his spare time up here, if you will, because he was a riverboat captain. He never really got away from his love for the river, and he would spend his time up here in this tower just watching the boats go by, if you will. Right behind his main residence is this very large building. This was for lack of a better way, a barn. It was a huge building, a huge barn. In it, he kept 6 different horse-drawn vehicles. They were, most of them were with wheels, wagons, but he also had several sleighs in here, and they used them in those days. Boy, it must have been kind of neat to see some of this going by in the wintertime. But it was so big, they had additional space. His wife, Henrietta Morrow, was a saint. That's all you can say about her. She was a saint. These folks started out as poor people. Down there, they lived, you know where 4th Avenue is in downtown Pittsburgh, where Kaufman's, kind of where Kaufman's is or was, and Macy's is screwing that all up and turning Kaufman's into something else. But anyway, down in that area, that's where they lived in the 1840s, and there was a big fire. They all got burnt out. And they moved across the south side of Pittsburgh and lived there for a while. And they all made their living from the time they were young boys, 14 and on. They went out on the river, which was a dangerous occupation. Very dangerous. They went out on the river, and those who survived did well. Vandergriff was one of the ones who did. But when he brought his wife up here and their family, they had 8 kids, which they raised, all 8 kids here in Oil City. When they came up here as a family in 1863, their first house was down there where Collins Plumbing is, at that end of Colbert, it was called Allegheny then, but down there in that area, it was almost right there at the border with Siverly. They built a house there, and then as he prospered, they built this big house in 1871 and moved up to this end, where Vandergriff lived. And W.J. Young, I might add. And I'm going to keep emphasizing W.J. Young, Vandergriff, and John R. Campbell, because they come into play in another way that most people don't realize. All right, some of the other houses. This is John R. Campbell's house on the south side, beautiful stick. we had an architectural conference here, a Victorian architectural conference here a couple of weeks ago, and people from outside the area, we took them around on a bus. They loved this house, absolutely loved it. It's a special house, a special example of stick. And it showed beautifully that day. The sun was great, the whole thing. But this was Camel's house. He lived here for decades. The H.L. Lewis Acceptance Company, which I mentioned, H.L. Lewis himself went to New York City. He was reassigned, if you will, by Standard Oil there to work as in the crude oil department for Standard Oil of New York. And Standard Oil of New York bought all of the crude for all the various refining companies for Standard Oil, and that was what Lewis did when he went to New York. When he went there, he actually took a lot of the trading activity from the Oil City Exchange and transferred it to the New York City Exchange. He built this house at the corner of, I think that's Hoffman, I'm not real sure, but it's up there in East Bissell. It's a beautiful house. If you ever get a chance to go in it, it's really nice inside. Really, really is. This is Venice Lewis's house today, and his wife's. Now, George Lewis, who stayed behind when H.L. Lewis went to New York, George Lewis, after his brother H.L. left, moved in here, and it's George Lewis and George Lewis's housekeeper, whom he married, this is the guy who's responsible for all those trusts, those Standard Oil trusts that still exist here in Oil City today. It's from the Lewises. All right. I mentioned earlier about some of the production companies associated with Standard Oil. Ohio Oil, which is now known, by the way, as Marathon Oil, big company, very interesting history, and doing very, very well out there in Finleyville now in Ohio. It was founded here in the National Transit Company in Oil City. It was the intent of that was to handle all the production activity for the Lima field in Ohio and Indiana. And the first president was William Fleming, and William Fleming built this really nice house, which recently has been repainted, thank goodness, and it looks great up there on Central Avenue, just above 3rd. The John Tonkin House still is looking good as usual up there on West 3rd Street. The Henry McSweeney House, which is now the Bell's Letters House. All National Standard men, beg your pardon, all National Transit and Standard Oil men. The Brundred House. Brundred became the manager of the Imperial Refinery later on, in the later years. And the Imperial Refinery was actually part of the Eclipse Lubricating Oil Organization. Brundred originally was associated more with the Eclipse per se in Sugar Creek, but then they made him the president of the Imperial Refinery in later years. You might think most of us know this house. P.H. Judd was the purchasing agent for Standard Oil in Oil City. This house is up there on Reed and West 2nd. And the Noah Clark House. Who was Noah Clark? South Penn Oil. He was the first president of the South Penn Oil Company. He was president of that for 5 years. And he built this house up on 3rd. In Titusville, Standard Oil men included these folks. Let's start with John D. Archibald. John D. Archibald was the leader of the pack. He was president of the Acme of Pennsylvania and Acme of New York. And at the time in Titusville, there was Acme Refinery, big Acme Refinery. Got to go back. Oops. This mouse is fast. Really fast. You should have seen the kids laughing at me this morning when the mouse was going all over the place. Ah, look at that old guy. At any rate, Lois wasn't here this morning. I'm glad. She teaches me how to do these things. But at any rate, the John D. Archibald House today is the administrative building for Titusville Pet. It was the old McKinney house. That family eventually took ownership of the Archibald place, and for years it was the McKinney house. William Scheide's house is up there, the original Scheide house. William Scheide was the a manager of the United Pipelines in the 1880s. And he built this beautiful place in West Main Street in Titusville. I like that picture, really do. These old Victorian houses photograph very, very well. The shadows in the wintertime, they're just great. It's a real treat. And then Joseph Seep, we mentioned. Now, Joseph Seep's house is a big old brick it's been taken down. It's now occupied by a contemporary brick, one-story contemporary brick. That was taken down, but his eldest daughter's house still exists. She was Lillian Seep, and she married this Dr. Quinby. And that house, the Lillian Seep, Dr. Quinby house, still stands on West Main Street in Titusville, another beautiful place. Dr. Quimby's office is just to the left of this. And then I mentioned Calvin Payne being the general manager and then the vice president of all those gas companies. His house is up there on East Main. Now, I haven't said much about Franklin and Standard Oil activity. I will now. What we have now, what remains of that is first the Galena Signal Oil building right there on Liberty in Franklin, and the Joseph Sibley House that is up there. It's River Ridge, Joseph Sibley House. You guys don't know it. You don't call it that. It's River Ridge. It's an estate that's it's up there in Cornblender Township. You can see it from. I tell people go down there to Burger King and put your back to Burger King, and then when the trees aren't full like they are right now, and it's not foggy like it's been forever, it seems, for the last couple months, you can then spot the River Ridge House. We try to point this out to people on the bus tour we had here a couple of weeks. I couldn't see it. Nobody could see it. And that's amazing. First year I've really run into that problem. But this is the Sibley House. Joseph Sibley was the founder of the Sibley part of the Galena, the Signal part of the Galena Signal Oil Company. It's all associated with railroad products. Signal oil was used in all those controlling signal lamps and a variety of other lamp uses for the railroad. They did very well. The plant was actually in the third ward, right inside the Galena property. And Galena Oil was the firm that's associated with Charles Miller, and their principal product was this beg your pardon, what is that called? Franklin oil? Heavy oil. The heavy oil around Franklin District heavy oil, which they injected and dissolved a lead salt into, and it became an outstanding lubricant for real heavy use, such as the journal bearings on railroads. And they had that business. Some people say Standard Oil unfairly monopolized that business, but there were other firms doing the same thing, making that same kind of product up in New York. So they did have competition. Charles Miller was not really willing to sell the Galena company to Standard Oil, but his other three partners who had equal ownership were. So it became the property of Standard Oil in 1879. Joseph Sibley was very willing to sell Signal Oil to Standard Oil. That became the property of Standard Oil in 1879. Charles Miller was the president of Galena after Standard Oil was purchased. Joseph Sibley was the president of Signal Oil, but the board of directors were all local Standard Oil men, including John D. Archibald, John Barstow from Titusville, and Jacob Vandergriff from Oil City. All righty. Well, come on, Mouse. See what's left. I don't know. Nothing. A big thank you. So thank you. That was Standard Oil around this area for all these decades. The Standard Oil companies, it's not really gone. It's just different. And having said that, all these companies, they shared a common history, they shared a common culture, they still do today, and a common legacy, and we are all part of that. So it's been a pleasure this evening to celebrate that history and that legacy, and I'm really glad you folks showed up. Thank you very much. Now, as these things go, I'm supposed to say, are there any questions? We asked that question this morning, and we got some surprising answers. Kids are surprising. Yeah.
Neil.
Yeah. Is that Dave? Old Dave, yeah.
Where exactly was the blood farm?
Blood farm, okay. You're you make the turn into Oil Creek State Park.
Yep.
You go up past the big white house on the left-hand side. That's called the Blood Farm House. That was really not John Blood's house. That was the company that bought that property, the production company that bought that property. That was their showpiece house, if you will. So all that's the Blood Farm. But where the wells were, the really big producing wells, as you keep going up the Park Road, when you come to the ice dam, and when you look across the ice dam, you see those flats on the far side. The ice dam kind of separates the property line. If you projected the line of the ice dam through that property on the other side, that's the border between the Tar Farm and the upper part of the Blood Farm. And right in there is where all those big Blood Farm wells down to the third sand in late 1881 were drilled, and they were immense. The Blood Farm was famous in late 1881 and in 1882, and it was in the papers. That's really what it amounted to, the Philadelphia and New York papers, and everybody wanted a piece of the action. That's why they were all willing to invest in the Blood Farm Oil Company, except that there was a fire over there on the flat, a big fire, and that big fire depleted all those wells. It burned out all the gas that was used to force the oil out of the ground, and they couldn't get any more flow out of the property. So all those people invested in the Blood Farm well, and they were left with pumpers. And the pumpers, they were getting, when that fire broke out, about 4,000 barrels a day out of that very small piece of land. And they were left with pumping 400 barrels a day if they were lucky. So, yeah, now.
In some quarters, as I was growing up, it was popular to sort of hit John D. Rockefeller on the head as a pretty bad guy.
Yeah.
And you seem to have a favorable impression of the Standard and Rockefeller.
Yes.
I do too.
Good.
Would you elaborate on that? Do you think he's the evil demon that he was portraying?
He's not the devil by any means. He was a 19th century businessman, and he did business according to the laws and the customs of the 19th century. He just did it better than everybody else. He was obviously a really smart guy, and he associated with really smart men like Vandergriff, and they were at the top of their game in the functions of the industry that they belonged to. And he brought all these people together. John D. Rockefeller did not rule Standard Oil. Do you honestly think Charles Lockhart and that guy in Philadelphia, William Warden, and guys like that, Charles Pratt, who had that big refinery in Long Island, these guys were big. They weren't going to let some young guy from Cleveland just willy-nilly tell them this is what you're going to do. No, he was the biggest investor of Standard Oil of Ohio, which was the company at the time, and as a result, he was always elected chairman of the board. He was the president. So it was a role he played, and that was the way you did things when there was various people owning various shares of the company. That's all that was. He had to convince them of the wisdom of their ways, if you will, for a decision that was being made. And most of those initiatives, if you will, did not come from John D. Rockefeller. They came from all those other owners who thought this was a good idea to do this and that. Most of those guys were refiners. The only producer in that whole group initially, well, there were two, but the guy who was the owner was Jacob Vandergriff himself. He was a producer. He owned Forest Oil Company in the 19th century, and Standard Oil bought an awful lot of oil directly from Forest Oil. And then that same firm became the one out there in Oklahoma and the Mid-Continent field. The name's escaping me right now, but Prairie Oil and Gas, which is a huge name. You know, the field out there at the turn of the century into the first part of the 20th century was immense. And Prairie Oil was the big pipeline company, the big producing company, the big refining company, all owned by Standard Oil, but that was all a derivative of something Jacob Vandergriff and his partners started. All right. Having said that, these guys they owned this company. They owned a lot of it. various shares of it. Yes, John D. Rockefeller had the most shares, but they all had a large interest in these companies. They weren't going to just let some young guy from Cleveland get away with whatever he wanted to do. That's not the way it went. Now, they were so good at what they did, and they became so big, and they combined all of their mutual interests with their mutual capital, that they were able to do things that nobody else was able to do. And they made money when nobody else could be making money. That's why they were so resented here in the oil region, because the producers were not making any money. They were going broke because they just produced too much crude at the time. There was no market for all that crude that they were producing. It just wasn't. So they couldn't get their return on what they invested, and they didn't think it was fair that they were going hungry while all these Standard Oil men associated with refining and the pipelines and the marketing, they were multi-millionaires. And in those days, that meant a lot. That meant a lot. It doesn't mean anything today, but that meant a lot then. So there was this resentment in the region, and of course, in the region, the papers picked up on it. Certain writers picked up on it because they were listening to Dad, who hated Standard Oil from the beginning because of the way things worked out for him. They were listening to all of that, and this lingering, seething hatred, which is still here in the region, came out. And you notice I'm emphasizing Oil City here. Marilyn knows this. I really am reluctant. Maybe I should shut up right now. You think I've said enough? But I emphasize Oil City and its association with Standard Oil. I emphasize Franklin and its association with Standard Oil. There's a healthy relationship. And anybody who knows their history, these were just businessmen doing business. You can't have that kind of a conversation even today in Titusville, and you know why. So having said that, yeah, I'm a big admirer of the organization. Did they do some things that you couldn't do today that are illegal today? But not then? Yes, they did. But they weren't then. They were doing the same thing that everybody else was doing. The issues with the railroads, it's all, give me another hour and a half and I'll talk about the railroads. But they weren't doing anything any different than anybody else at the time. They were just better at it. Ron.
Neil, look at those houses.
The ones that are in these images?
The different ones you showed, like the one across from the city on.
I don't know. I've never actually encountered.
Yeah, I wondered what,
I don't know, Ron.
They're so big.
They're so big. In today's, I don't know. That's my best answer. They obviously were very, very expensive.
In those days.
$6,000. Pardon me?
The house we lived in on Willow Street was $6,000.
Well, and look how nice that house is. And so you can gauge. I think, now I do have a gauge, somewhat. Now this would be in the 1870s. There's, up in Titusville, there's the Crocker House, which became known as the Roberts House, which is on, I believe, Perry Avenue. It's a big Italianette, and there's a big garage associated with it. And it's known for its wainscoting on all floors. And it's the one that has that railing, that big brass railing around it was nickel-plated. And it's kind of in disrepair now, but I know it cost Crocker, who built that thing, $10,000 in 1872 to build that house. And that's a really big house, and it was so well finished. It's just a wonderful place. So $10,000. But put it the other way. What did an ordinary house cost? What? A couple $100, if that. So and the other thing about houses in those days, we got to remember, those guys weren't paying big income taxes like you have to today. They had a lot of discretionary income, and one of the things you did when you made it in the 19th century with your discretionary income, and it was considered very appropriate. You built a nice big house, the bigger the better. And your wife really loved you all that much more, so you were a very happy man. Those kinds of things. So that's what people did. Nothing wrong with that. Good for them. Of course, this is a different day and age. I would say something like the Brundert House. It was built, I guess, in the 1880s. I would guess probably $15,000, something like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's so well finished. Now you can find references to these places in the derrick now and then. Well, that's the other thing I wanted to mention, the derrick. Was the Derrick Standard Oil owned company? Yes, was. I mentioned William J. Young. I mentioned John R. Camel. John R. Camel and William J. Young and an attorney from the United Pipelines paid $10,000 for the derrick from that Longwell company that owned it prior to those guys buying it. And the company they formed was the Derrick Publishing Company. That is in the court records right down there in Franklin. Nobody can argue with that. They owned that at least by 1882. They may have owned it in the sense that they bought into the Longwell Company before that, which might account for why they had that change in editorial policy even before that. But they owned it, yes. Even the Boyle family doesn't seem to want to admit to that. I don't know why, but that's a case. And then, of course, in 1885, they leased it. They didn't sell it. They leased it to P.C. Boyle. And then that was a lease to own. That's what that agreement was. And it took him 10 years to pay off that lease and own the property. Was P.C. Boyle a Standard Oil man? In my opinion, he was. He was criticized roundly because of some of the opinions he took, particularly by the still remaining independents like Thomas Phillips, for example, or Emory up there in Bradford. Well, you got to get into that to really understand who was right and who was wrong, if you even ever come to that kind of a conclusion. But that's how you handle that. I recommend, if you really want to get into the history of Standard Oil, I recommend the one written by Alan Nevins. One book, it's a 2-volume book, was written in 1940, before the Second World War. Alan Nevins grew up between 1940 and 1952. He had a change of mind. You can tell if you read his second history. The one was called John D. Rockefeller, and the other one was Study in Power. And he grew in his maturity when it comes to business history. And he's much more, what would you call it? He finally came to the conclusion that the men at Standard Oil were a special group of men. They were brilliant. They were the men of the times. That's just all you can say for them. And that's the history that I use. There are other histories out there that will refute that and what have you, but at your choice, read what you want. Yeah, I do like them. That was a long-winded answer for your question, huh?
That was 4 questions ago.
Okay. Okay, any other questions? All right, now I want to thank some people. Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez, for your courtesy of us using this beautiful campus. I was here this morning, too, and it's beautiful, just beautiful. But I also have to thank the Harvey Lecture Series Committee, and there's my friend Betsy sitting right there, Betsy Kellner, Marilyn Black's involved in that. Let's see. 2 other, come on, Betsy, help me out. Oh, Hope Lyman, thank you, Hope. And who's the? Terry, where's Terry? Dr. Terry Latour, yeah, head of the library activity at Clarion University. He's been great over the years for a lot of things that we've done down here. Those are the folks who really were the committee to put this together. They actually interviewed me. Imagine that. It was like going for a job interview. I'm good, huh? But they're responsible for continuing this, and thank you to that committee. I think we've kind of run out of time. Anything else you want to say, Hope, back there?
Thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you, everybody.